Hi, I'm Joan London. If you're looking for senior care for your mom or dad like I was, call A Place for Mom, the nation's largest senior living referral service. Their local advisors will explain your options and help you select senior living communities at no cost to you.
To speak with a local senior living advisory, call A Place for Mom at 800-211-4992. That's 800-211-4992.
There's a place for answers, a place for Mom.
Hi, this is Dr. Ned Hallowell, and welcome to Distraction. Recently, I spoke to the New York State Association of Independent Schools educators who work at schools that specialize in kids who have attention deficit disorder, dyslexia, other learning issues. And it was an amazing turnout. 500 teachers and administrators came. Unbelievable turnout. I think it's the biggest crowd NYSACE, New York State Association of Independent Schools, has ever convened. It was a really spectacular day. In any case, what you'll hear next is an excerpt from my talk to the educators from the New York State Association of Independent Schools.
Thank you so much. What I want to do with you today, yes, I'm going to get into the history of this condition and where we are, but I want to start with a call to action. And you're the first group that I've done this with. I'll be doing it with all other groups that I talk to. But the time has come, I believe, for us to really engineer a quantum leap forward. We really need to dismantle and throw away the black hole of the deficit-based model. There are parents who say to me when I was diagnosed, and I told a friend, you would have thought I told her my son was diagnosed with leukemia. These outpourings, oh, I'm so sorry, oh, what can I do to help? This must be so traumatic for you. We really need to blow that up. We really need to educate the public and really have a concerted, organized effort. As you know, the kids are suffering around the country where schools like you all come from don't exist. These kids are warehoused in resource rooms, so-called resource rooms, where what they get is basically glorified babysitting. And then in some of the more primitive parts of the country, really primitive things happen. Physical punishment is still practiced. There was one school in Kentucky where a kid was handcuffed to a desk by the police, and the school board thought that was a very good idea. That kid needed discipline. So there is active abuse going on every day. And it is on a par with all the other forms of prejudice and abuse that we've seen, and it's time to correct it. It's time to, and you all are leading the way with what you do. You are leading the way, but it's time to organize. It's time to stand up, get angry, but not just get angry. Trumpet the truth. Tell the truth. Tell the real story. Tell the real story about David Nealman, who struggled in school and couldn't learn, came from a very devout Mormon family in Utah where they valued education. He worked as hard as he could. He was a very conscientious student, and he just couldn't get it. And he got to Brigham Young. His family had connections, and they shoehorned him into Brigham Young. He got in there, and he said, this is just crazy. I'm taking up a spot. And he dropped out, and his parents were ashamed. He disgraced the family. They were very upset with him. What's going to happen to you, David? You have to earn a living. We can't support you your whole life. You're just gonna clunk along and go nowhere. And he said, "Yeah, Mom and Dad, but I can't. There's no reason for me to be here. I'm learning nothing. I'm wasting time." So he struck out on his own, which is the ADD way. I still call it ADD, by the way, because when I learned about it in 1981, that's what it was called. And I don't want to add the extra letter out of stubbornness, which is common among people who have ADD. So he went out and looked for a job. And he landed a job in Canada, working for a travel agency of all places. He had no particular interest in travel, but it gave him a job. And then his ADD mind started to percolate. And he said, why don't we combine airfare with rentals when you get there? And he was one of the founders of timeshare. And they put that together and started selling these package deals, and they sold like gangbusters. And he learned about both business and travel and aviation. And next thing you know, he got hired by Southwest Airlines. And he started climbing the ladder at Southwest. Again, no training, no education, no college degree, nothing. Just a whole lot of LD and ADHD. Could barely read, and but was able to think and think creatively. And climbed his way up the ladder at Southwest until, lo and behold, Herb Kelleher, the head of Southwest, put him on the board. Well, that's when bad things started to happen, and this is typical of people with ADD. See, people with ADD don't know how to kiss ass, and that's a real problem if you're on a board in a corporation. He was not able to be politically correct, and he also suffered from the problem of being a whole lot more creative than all the other people on the board. And they all were very good at playing politics, and what they lacked in talent and creativity, they made up for in ambition and the Machiavellian skill. And so they conspired to get David fired. And sure enough, Herb Kelleher fired him. He says to this day it was the biggest mistake he ever made, but those other people on the board who had nothing better to do than conspire to bring David down, and this happens all over the city, it's happening right now. People who have what I call attention surplus disorder are conspiring to bring down the talented people who don't have time to play politics and look out for the people who want to undermine them. So he got fired, out of work again. Well, again, typical ADD. He doesn't give up. He says, fine, I'll just start my own airline. So he starts a little outfit called JetBlue. And the day JetBlue went public, he became phenomenally wealthy. In a matter of hours, he made hundreds of millions of dollars. And he and I have become friends. And he said, driving home that night, was I driving home to celebrate? He said, no, I felt like the same loser who couldn't hack it in school. And see, that's what we need to prevent. And now, by the way, he's left JetBlue. Now he's started an airline in Brazil and Portugal. He's continuing this amazing, and he has 9 children. He's a philanthropist. He's one of the great men in the world, and yet he feels at his core like he's fundamentally flawed. He said, I will never get rid of that. We need to prevent that. We need to prevent that. And it's so preventable. It's simply a matter of how you frame the condition. It's simply a matter of how you treat these people. That's a mission that we really need to get behind. We need to take it to that next level. So all those people out there, all those kids, and for every one David, there's probably 1 million who languish, who don't get the benefit of going to one of your schools, who don't get the benefit of having a teacher who intuitively understands them, who don't get what they need. So many wonderfully creative, I call them magnificently minded people, wasted simply for lack of knowledge. They get dismissed as stupid, as lazy. Why waste resources on them? A lot of the schools in this city, they won't come right out and tell you, but they don't want to take these kids. Why? Because they don't want stupid kids bringing down the test scores, reducing their rate of acceptance to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. This is a shame, and we need to fix it. I really want to see the day when all kids will be like my son Jack when he was 10 years old at Shady Hill School in Cambridge, where all my kids went. All my kids have ADD. Shady Hill is not a school that specializes in ADD, but it's a school that's friendly to people who learn differently. And one day the teacher asked the kids to write down adjectives describing themselves. And then she said, now circle the 3 adjectives that you're proudest of. And Jack circled athletic, creative, and ADD. And that's what I want kids to feel. And it's a very realistic goal. I am proud as can be that I have ADD as well as dyslexia. I wouldn't trade them for the world. I'm not saying it's an unmitigated blessing. You know only too well that it can be a struggle to learn how to read and process information and manage all the details of everyday life. But you can do it. You can do it. And then your gifts can come to the fore. Well, with that as sort of a preface, let me back up. So the history of these conditions, where did they come from? When I first learned about ADHD back in 1981, I'd never heard of it until then. If you told me someone had attention deficit disorder, I would have thought it was some psychoanalytic concept about a kid who didn't get enough attention. And I learned about it, and I had this great aha moment where, I said, wow, that's me. I'd always known I was a slow reader. I had dyslexia, but I hadn't known about this ADD thing. And then I met Priscilla Vale, this incredibly wonderful woman. I hope some of you were lucky enough to know her. She was at Ripwam-Siskwa School and just another autodidact. She taught herself everything about learning differences. She wrote one of the classic books in the field, I hope it's still in print, called Smart Kids with School Problems. And she just gives practical tips. If you're a teacher and you want practical tips, read any of Priscilla's books. They're just chock full of practical tips on how to help these kids in the classroom. When I give a talk, I want people to take home stuff they can use on Monday. That was her phrase, can you use it on Monday? I guess she gave most of her talks on Saturday. But she was about 5 feet tall and just a pepper pot, just so full of life. And just, she brought me into this field. She said, you really should take this seriously and because we need help. As you look back in history, these conditions were completely unheard of. There were basically 2 diagnoses. There was smart and stupid. And there was basically one treatment, try harder. And if you back up, 500 years, you can certainly find examples of children who had the symptoms of ADHD who were particularly distractible, particularly impulsive, particularly restless, who couldn't follow directions, who couldn't sit still, who couldn't do what they were told. And, of course, the assumption was they wouldn't. See, the framework was the moral diagnosis, often colored by theology. The notion was the free will ruled everything, and your soul was a contest, a proving ground between God and the devil. God and the devil were in competition for ownership of the child's will. And if the child didn't do what he or she was supposed to do, and it was usually he, that meant the devil was winning. So, what was the prescribed treatment? Beat the child. Beat the devil out of the child. These are the battered children throughout history. It's a horrible, horrible, grim story of these kids were tortured and daily and in the name of God. And as someone who's a practicing Christian, I'm an Episcopalian and I take it very seriously, the kind of horrible child abuse that has been committed in the name of God is absolutely horrific. But that's what happened. Wise elders thought that was what these kids needed. The fact that it absolutely did no good, in fact, did a lot of harm. Well, of course, the truth doesn't penetrate that kind of desperate ignorance. And so that's what happened. Moral diagnosis. Not trying hard enough, punish them is the treatment. So try harder and get punished, usually beaten. Shamed, humiliated, and beaten. Thousands of years, that's what happened. And believe me, that tradition has not disappeared. You can still find plenty of people out there who say all he or she needs is a kick in the pants. I'll never forget, I was on an airplane not long ago, flying back from Europe. And I was in business class, and so the flight attendants had more time, and this woman was brushing her long blonde hair, and I was doing some writing, and she said, "What are you writing about?" And I said, "ADD." And she held up her hairbrush and said, "This will cure ADD." Meaning if you hit the kids with the hairbrush, that'll take care of them. This is commonplace today. The echoes of that moral diagnosis. Be on the alert for it. It should be as unacceptable as racism or sexism, you name it, and yet it's commonly accepted. Nobody takes anyone to task on it. Nobody says, you don't talk that way. We sort of awkwardly laugh. Yeah, I guess a kick in the pants. No, not a kick in the pants. It's been tried millions and millions and millions of times. It doesn't work. It is counterproductive. This moral model is completely wrong. Telling someone with ADD to try harder is no more helpful than telling someone who's nearsighted to squint harder. It misses the point, and yet you will find parents, I would dare say the majority of parents, believe that it's a matter of discipline and effort, and they're haranguing these kids to try harder. And all it does is make the poor kid think there's really no hope for me because I'm trying as hard as I can and it's not getting the results. And so the kids go into hiding. They learn avoidance as a coping style. They develop a false self. They get depressed. They get angry. They're an absolute setup to use drugs when they get a little bit older. It does tremendous damage, this moral model. And what makes it so scary is it's part of our culture's DNA. You know, it's the knee-jerk response is try harder and get more discipline. You know, it's the work ethic and all these cliches that in a different context are useful and well-meaning, but in this context they are really pernicious, really damaging. But that's the history that we're living with. That's the legacy that we have to correct all the time in parent-teacher conferences and when you're out talking to people. I almost dread it when I'm with a group and they get on this because I think, do I really want to get into this or not? Because you're really fighting upstream. You're a target to be laughed at. Oh, you bleeding heart, you know, don't you realize, kids need discipline. And their ignorance, there's nothing like ignorance to empower someone. That's the history of these conditions. Smart, stupid, try harder, and get beaten. That pretty much sums it up. In the 20th century, thank God, things began to change. And philosophers and doctors and scientists, challenged this notion that free will controls everything. Saying free will doesn't control everything is upsetting as Copernicus saying the Earth is not at the center of the solar system. People did not want to hear that. We like to believe we have control. Well, we don't. So when it came to the condition we now call ADHD, in 1937, something amazing happened. A doctor in East Providence, Rhode Island, took a whole bunch of kids who would otherwise have been put in reform schools, which, by the way, another euphemism, anything but reform went on in those reform schools. It was a place to shackle kids and beat them and, the same old story. So anyway, he took these kids and said, I'm going to try anything I can. He was just one of these innovators. And they tried different clothing, different diet, different lighting. And one day he read in an unrelated journal about amphetamine and its impact on cognition. He said, let's give these kids amphetamine. Well, here you had a ward full of hyperactive, that's what it was called back then, hyperkinetic boys. You're going to give them speed. His head nurse probably thought poor old Bradley'd gone around the bend, he'd had one too many. But he gave them amphetamine. And sure enough, in 20 minutes, you saw improvement. They were able to sit down, raise their hand, concentrate. And far from their being lazy, they loved the pill. They called it their arithmetic pill because they were now able to memorize these infernally boring math facts that they'd simply been unable, not unwilling, unable to sit still for. They gave them amphetamine. They were able to do it. Their arithmetic pill, they could learn math facts, and they were off to the races. Huge deal, not only in the treatment of this condition, but in our understanding of the mind in general. That biology is at work. It's not just a matter of hard work. Sure, hard work matters, always matters. But biology is in play here, and genetics. And that is the wonderfully encouraging good news the general public doesn't know about. Now, this happened in 1937. Knowledge travels slowly. Here we are almost 100 years later, 75 years later anyway, and most people don't know about it. Well, the condition got renamed minimal brain dysfunction. I qualify for that diagnosis. I wouldn't necessarily want to go to a job interview and say, "Hi, I'm Ned Hallowell. I have minimal brain dysfunction." But it did represent progress because it located the problem now in the brain. It wasn't minimal willpower dysfunction or minimal God versus devil dysfunction. It was minimal brain dysfunction. And sure enough, research continued. People began to notice the invisible symptom of attention varied. And as they began to look at that, sure enough, the kids who had MBD, their attention varied more than other kids. So the condition got renamed attention deficit disorder. And then in the 1990s, big breakthrough decade, so-called decade of the brain. When I learned about it, people were still saying this is made up, this is a yuppie excuse to get out of doing work. I'd go on talk shows and people would flat out say, "How do you know this is not just a made-up condition to help people get out of doing their homework?" But in the 1990s, with the brain scans, the PET scans, MRI, we proved a biological basis to it, where you can actually see anatomical differences and differences at the level of cellular metabolism, energy uptake. So we proved this is a condition with biological roots and that is highly heritable. Twin adoption studies, family studies showed that this is genetically transmitted. Big deal, because now it was intellectually indefensible to say it doesn't exist. That doesn't mean some people still don't do it, but they don't have a leg to stand on in terms of scientific knowledge. We now know both dyslexia and ADHD have their roots in anatomy and genetics. Where we are today is a whole lot better than where we used to be, but there is this major problem. If you go to most centers around the country, and the world certainly, and you want to get diagnosed, your child or you as an adult, what you'll get is testing and your history, and you'll come out with a 10-page single-spaced report that documents in impeccable PhDs all the ways in which you are defective, disordered, disabled, less than, and it's all very well-meaning, and it's all very smart and very accurate and very reproducible and all those good things, but nobody really takes into account the impact on the parent and the child. Nobody really thinks about that, and because that's not what training is about. You're trained either as an MD or a PhD or an MSW, whatever. Well, the MSWs are trained in strengths, but the PhDs and the MDs, I'm an MD, we're trained in pathology. We're trained to look for pathology, which is fine if you're dealing with a kidney, because we don't identify with our kidneys unless we're psychotic, But with your mind, that's who we are. When you say you're really referring to your mind. And so when you give someone an irrefutable document that says your mind is really effed up, that's pretty devastating. And we, the providers, don't think about that because we're so caught up in being smart and finding all these morsels of pathology that we paid a lot of money and spent many years training to be able to do. So we do our little tricks and hand it off, and the parent goes out into the car and cries and feels like she's, usually the mother, feels like she's just been kicked in the stomach. And she hopes her kid didn't hear it. That's where we are. This deficit-based model does tremendous harm. Inadvertently. Again, well-meaning people. Just like the people 500 years ago who said, beat your child because that's what he needs. They're well-meaning. Well, our current equivalent of that is these devastating reports that parents take home as hard evidence that their kid can't be president, even though I can name you presidents who I'd bet anything had it, and can't be David Nealman, can't be Tim Armstrong, can't excel at the very highest levels. If you believe you can't, you won't. But if you believe you can, you will. And it used to be sort of a bromide, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Now it's a scientific fact. We've got to take that very seriously. We really need to be in the business of telling these people the truth, which is they can. Because if we tell them implicitly or explicitly they can't, they won't. But my goodness, isn't it good news that if we tell them they can, they will? We got to start doing that. So if you come to my office, you will get a diagnosis that includes strengths. What's the flip side of distractibility? What's good about distractibility? Curiosity. These kids are incredibly curious. And curiosity is a major life asset. You got to control it again. You don't want to exercise your curiosity by looking into places where you shouldn't, but it's something you can't buy and you can't teach curiosity, and these kids have it in spades. Impulsivity, that's my favorite one. Oh, it's so impulsive, which is used as a synonym for bad. No control, no self-control, impulsive. Well, let me ask you, what is creativity but impulsivity gone right? You don't plan to have a creative idea. You don't say it's 2:45, time for my creative idea, and lay it like an egg. You know, it just doesn't happen that way. Creativity depends upon impulsivity, depends upon spontaneity, depends upon disinhibition. If you're not a little bit disinhibited, you're not going to be creative. Your mind, you know, the attention surplus people, they never have new ideas. Yeah, by the way, I don't mean to dismiss them. We need them. It's a great team, an ADD person and an attention surplus. The ADD is the idea person. The attention surplus is the implementer. And it's a wonderful partnership. And then the third one, hyperactivity, what's good about that? You get to be my age, it's called energy, you know. I'm really glad I've got that little turbo power. And so once again, we need to frame this in a way that allows for the positive, not to whitewash it and say there's no downside. A Ferrari with no brakes is very dangerous. But with brakes, it wins races. With brakes, these kids will and do change the world. Thomas Edison was a classic, you know, classic ADD. But you frame it like that, you see, and what happens is you recruit all the motivation, enthusiasm, not only in the child but in the parents, that the deficit-based model absolutely expels. The deficit-based model, with all its emphasis on negative, no one gets excited about that. Oh, I'm going to go get my medication. I'm going to go get my tutoring. I'm going to go get my remediation. It's a total downer. And that's why these kids feel down. And so this strength-based model is so much more than just semantics. It's all about setting forth the treatment in such a way that you maximize the chances for optimal results. You get the parents, the kids, obviously the teachers, in your case obviously, but anything but obvious in schools that don't get it, on the same page of we're going to unwrap the gifts. Do we have work to do? Yes. It is very hard to strengthen these brakes. Meds help, but they don't do the whole thing. But if we keep at it, we will get there. You know, people say, how did you get through medical school? Well, my 5th grade math teacher put such a premium on attention to detail, but he turned it into a game. When he had like almost a rabbinical set of rules of where the period went, how you wrote the heading, what should be script, what should be printed, what numbers should be circled, what numbers should have a point after them. I mean, what the 3-ring notebook couldn't be. I mean, he had like 30 rules, stupid rules. But if you managed to hand in a homework paper that obeyed every single one of those rules, the answers to the problems didn't matter. That was irrelevant. But if you handed it in perfect form, he would do this big display in front of the room of weeping. Oh no, a perfect paper. And we were young enough, we just thought that was the funniest thing in the world. And so I felt hugely motivated to pay attention to stupid detail. Well, that's what medical school is all about. Believe me, it's the intellectual equivalent of boot camp. It's all about paying rapt attention to stupid details. And I learned that from Mr. Goodhue back in the 5th grade. I built that muscle, if you will. It is a muscle in your brain. It's not a real muscle, but it's a collection of neurons that I built then, and I can call on it at will. I can fill out the dumbest form you ever want to hand me in triplicate, and I know what I'm calling it. I just sit there, I go, and I back to 5th grade, back to medical school. And it's what you're training these kids. And if you turn it into a game, anything can become interesting. And he made it a game by giving us this theatrical, performance. And so, he motivated me to do something that otherwise I would never have done. I mean, this stuff was colossally boring. But because I envisioned Mr. Goodhue going, I learned how to do it. You have to think outside the box a little bit with these kids. And that you all know this so well, and you're doing it. I mean, it's inspiring to be talking to you because do you know how rare you are? There's 500 of you in this room. There's probably not another 500 of you in the entire country. It's very, very rare to find teachers who get it. And what you're doing is not just saving crippled children. You're developing tomorrow's leaders. You are developing the people who will lead the way in medicine, in artificial intelligence, in aeronautics, in literature. It's not just in science, in innovating, in music. I mean, it's you are training these kids. You really are. And framing it in this strength-based way is so critically important. And I'm not saying you have to love your students, but you want to create an atmosphere that's akin to love. That's totally accepting, that is totally on your side, that is totally not shaming. Yes, you have to set limits, of course, strengthen those brakes. But when you say your brakes failed you, see, that's not shaming, as opposed to saying you bad boy. That's shaming. But when you say your brakes failed you, they say, yeah, I got to work on those brakes. And they'll buy into that. And they don't like it when they act out, because they don't. They feel bad about it later. And so I got to work on those brakes. Okay, so I'm not a bad boy, but I got to work on my brakes. See, and that's the force of connection. And when you have a school culture that emphasizes connection, that's the missing ingredient in so many learning environments today. Not to mention work environments. Oh my God, don't get me started there. I mean, the biggest reason people underperform at work is they have overloaded circuits and they don't get enough human connection. You put those two together and you get underperformance. But the same is true in the classroom. So create, however you do it, create a force field of positive energy, of connection. Do it through humor, through play, through structure. Absolutely need structure. Kids, particularly with these conditions, love structure. And they will keep pushing the limits until they get it. They like authority. They like you to be in charge. They really do like it. They don't want you to shame and humiliate them, but they do want you to take over. Recognize your calling. You all really have a calling. You are uniquely qualified to help develop our uniquely talented population of different learners. You are, and I'm not blowing smoke at all. People do better when they realize they're a part of a grand mission. And you really are part of a grand mission. See it, name it, own it. You truly are making a life-changing difference. If I had not had the teachers I had, I would be today, I should be marginalized or even dead, given the obstacles I faced, not just dyslexia and ADD, but I had a psychotic father, an alcoholic, abusive stepfather. My mother became alcoholic. I got sent away to boarding school when I was 10 years old. People with those numbers against them don't do well. And the reason I have is because of the force of connection. Now, I include God in that. Some of you don't believe in God. That's fine. To me, if you don't believe in God, I just say, well, God is love. And you believe in love. Nobody doesn't believe in love. So the force of love, which really is the force of connection. And you are providing that plus all the marvelous skills that you impart, all the incredible tools that didn't exist back when I was in first grade. These kids who are lucky enough to go to your schools get to have. So, boy, oh boy, please, when you go home today, just feel the uplift of knowing your You're doing incredible work that these kids just wouldn't get were it not for you. They just wouldn't. And the days when they're driving you crazy, and the days when, the answer to the question, how many times do I have to tell you? Oh, about 1,000, And just know that you're part of a team, and if you keep at it, a good outcome will happen because you're all working together in connection.
Well, there you have the excerpt from my talk at Grace Church School to the New York educators. It's just tremendously important that we get the word out to educators, to parents, to professionals of all stripes, to pretty much everyone. This is maybe one of the last prejudices, biases that we have left in our society that really hasn't been addressed. We've addressed racism, we've addressed, not solved it, but we've addressed racism, sexism, ageism, the various ignorance-based prejudices. And the one that we really haven't done a very good job with is brain differences. And a lot of these kids are thought of mistakenly as stupid. They're anything but stupid. They're usually quite gifted in various ways. And I tell people all the time, I don't treat disabilities. I help people unwrap their gifts. So I hope you enjoyed the excerpt we brought you, and please stay in touch with us. Please tell your friends about distraction, and look forward to talking to you next time. Distraction is produced by Collisions Media, a division of CRN International.
Attention all authors. Page Publishing is looking for authors. Have you written a book and want to get it published? Page Publishing will get your book into bookstores and for sale online at Amazon, Apple iTunes, and other outlets. They handle all aspects of the publishing process for you. Printing, cover art, publicity, copyright, and editing. Call 800-292-8137 now for your free author submission kit. That's 800-292-8137 for your free author submission kit. Again, that's 800-292-8137.